Welcome to Transforming Destructive Conflicts, addressing poverty and social inequality. Thank everyone for joining us. If you have not done so already, please turn off or silence all your phones, any electronic devices, things like that. I'm Dr. Scott Debb. I'm an adjunct here at Thomas Nelson Community College. And in the psychology department, I'm joined by my department chair, Dr. Linda Hahn, in the back over there. Today, we're able to bring in a guest speaker who is an expert in the field of conflict analysis. And this is as a result of a Thomas Nelson Community College Foundation mini grant. The grant was awarded to us by the foundation in part to help raise awareness for social issues that have the potential to cause significant conflict in our lives, and also in part to help promote a relatively new course that we've been developing here at the school, which is course PSY 205, Personal Conflict and Crisis Management. The course is geared towards a wide range of individuals who are looking to pursue careers within any of the helping professions, or more generally, just those students who plan on working with people at some point in their personal or professional lives. In reality, we're all social creatures, in one way or another, so having the skills and awareness necessary to productively work with people on a consistent basis can benefit potentially everyone. Overall, the course is really an exploration into personal growth and personal development as we seek to learn more about ourselves and how we, as individuals, can be used as the tools for social change and social justice. I hope some of you choose to enroll in the course at some point in your near academic future. But for right now, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker for the evening. Dr. Richard Rubenstein is a professor at George Mason University's School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution, which happens to be the oldest and largest conflict studies program in the nation. He's also taught political science at Roosevelt University and law at Antioch School of Law. He was educated at Harvard College, a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University, and also studied religious nature of conflict, with his most recent book being titled Reasons to Kill: Why Americans Choose War. The focus of his talk tonight discusses the role of conflict resolution experts, whose job it is to analyze dysfunction generated by various systems in a society with regards to social diseases that are in our society, and the attempts that we have made to eradicate such evils such as poverty and inequality. The premise for tonight's talk is that for us to have a healthy national community, we must address the transformative approaches to new policy development that have the potential to impact the obstacles to having and maintaining a socially just culture. With those obstacles including things like unemployment, deep poverty, deindustrialization, corporate governance, and over-globalization. Dr. Rubenstein will also consider the role of psychosocial obstacles that prevent us from effectively implementing new solutions, and the institutional obstacles that hinder new policies from being effectively implemented. Our lecture will conclude sometime between 7:15 and 7:30, where we'll pause for a few moments to allow people to sign the attendance roster outside the front door over here. If you want to leave at that point, you can. However, we'll have a dedicated question and answer session after that, after the lecture is over. So please hold all your questions until the end if you have any. Otherwise, I would like to now introduce Dr. Richard Rubenstein to the podium.
Thank you very much. It's nice of you to have me back again. Fall visit and a spring visit, which is fun. And I appreciate that very nice introduction. When there's a guy named Adlai Stevenson who ran for president a couple of times on the Democratic ticket, and once he was introduced, he had such this incredibly glowing introduction, and he got up and he said, "Thank you for that introduction. After hearing that introduction, I can hardly wait to hear what I have to say." Well, I think you're going to be interested in this material because it's important, so important to all of us. And because there's still so much mystery really about it. There's a great mystery, and that's the subject of my talk really is this mystery. Mystery if I could put it like this, is how come when we know how bad things are with respect to poverty and inequality, we don't do very much about it. There's such a disjunction between our understanding of what the problem is and the absence of effective solutions that it starts to make you wonder what's really going on here. What's the underlying problem that's creating this gap between our understanding and our ability to act in a creative way to address these problems. So let's start out with the problem. And I'm not going to recite a lot of statistics. That's the way these talks usually start. And I think it's also actually part of the problem that that's kind of the way we think of it. We think of numbers in terms of abstraction. You know, I'm sure, I'll give you a couple of statistics in case you don't know these things, but I think you probably do, that 1 out of 6 American children is living in poverty, and that number goes to about 1 in 3 in minority communities and impoverished rural communities. You know, we have 25 million people unemployed, one of the highest unemployment rates in any of the industrialized countries. And in fact, if you compare us with other industrialized countries, we rank at or near the bottom on all kinds of other measures, especially measures involving poverty-related and inequality-related social problems. The most obvious are things like crime. Right? We've had 4 presidential commissions that have told us that poverty is intimately related to crime, that it generates crime. And yet, we're incarcerating more people in the United States than any country on earth, including China. We know that we have deep poverty in many parts of the country, which means that people's social lives, their community lives are fractured or smashed by so much need that it's impossible to deal with the need and maintain a lot of traditions of communities. When the only growth industry in a particular community is the drug industry, guess what? People are going to do it. They're going to do drugs. They're going to sell drugs. I have students at our graduate program in Arlington who are former gangbangers and drug dealers who have enrolled in this program to try to figure out what's really happening. Why did they do what they did? And how can other people be helped to not do what they did? But this deep poverty is transgenerational. It's passed on from parents to children, and then to their children. Which means, of course, that insofar as there's deep poverty, or insofar as there's endemic inequality in our country, we're no longer the land of opportunity. And the Nobel Prize winner, Joseph Stiglitz, has just written an article in the New York Times on Sunday. You can Google it. Stiglitz, in which he says why America is no longer the land of opportunity. One of the things that Stiglitz talks about is that median wages in the United States, what people are getting paid for their work, have been stagnant or dropping since, guess when? Guess when the wage stagnation started? I've asked people in a small crowd where I ask people this question and people answer it, and people generally say 2007 or 2000, when the economic crisis hit. Well, it's where the bottom really started to drop out was the 70s. In the 1970s, you may remember we had a war on poverty. That's what the Lyndon Johnson administration called their anti-poverty programs, the war on poverty. And poverty won. So one of the things Stiglitz is pointing out is this wage stagnation. Is that he also points out growing inequality in the country to the point that, you've seen the statistics, the richest 1% of the population control as much wealth as the bottom 20% of the population, that sort of thing. On all those scales, by the way, if you compare us with Europe, we're at the bottom. No European country has as much inequality. No European country has as much crime. No European country has as much infant mortality, etc. So what's the point? All right? Well, the Europeans have an interesting concept that I'll mention briefly, because you have poverty, okay, you have this growing inequality, which means that, by the way, which is linked to an increasing rigidity of our class system. Right? Yes, Virginia, there are such things as social classes, and there was a time when people could fairly realistically dream of moving from poverty to the employed working class, from the working class to the middle class, when I say middle, I mean the true middle class, not what's called now the middle class, which is everybody. Like people who are neither poor nor rich. And to move from the middle class to the upper middle, and from there even to the upper class. The last decade when those dreams were being realized on a fairly large scale was the 1870s. And it's been pretty much downhill ever since, to the point that now, we are now at the bottom of the industrialized state scale in class movement, class mobility. We have an immobile system. And what the Europeans have done is to add a concept to this, which I think you might find interesting, the concept of precarity, precariousness, or what they call precarity. That means that there are lots of people in the society, enormous numbers of people in the society, who are not comfortably well off and secure, who are also not in poverty, but who are in precarity, which means one bad thing happens to them and they're in the soup. One disease too many, right? One medical disaster, one company going under and laying off all its employees, or exporting jobs to some other country so there's no jobs left here. One community ravaged by urban problems that people start pulling out of the community. A lot of people are very close to that line. They're living under a condition of precarity. And an interesting thing that happens to people in precarity often is that, not that they get radicalized, which you might think. People might say, listen, I worked all my life and I'm making I'm making what I'm making, not very much, but I'm supporting a family, I'm supporting myself, nobody's in jail, we're keeping our heads above water. But one bad thing happens to me and I'm going under. That can't be, that's not just, that's not right. That needs to be changed, but instead, people who live under the condition of precarity tend to become conservative. And I don't mean in the political, I'm not talking about red state, blue state conservatism. I mean in the more general sense that they try not to rock the boat, that they are afraid something bad's going to happen. And when you go around in fear and afraid something bad that is going to happen, you're not going to raise your voice very too loud. Right? You're not going to make waves. So, how then do we think now about these problems? How do we think about them? How do we talk about them? Let me say that it's a more complicated question than you might think, and one that I'm sure I don't have all the answers to at all, but I have a few impressions that I'll share with you about how we think and talk about these problems. One I already mentioned, that we cite a lot of statistics. And we cite statistics in a way that distances us from the problem. Even if you're poor yourself or in precarity yourself, when you start dealing in statistics and in abstractions like the middle class, whatever that is, it includes everybody from the poverty line to Bloomberg. What happens is that you have one of the things that you've done is to rid the problem area of emotion. You're talking in this sort of dry, statistical, super-rational, cognitive way about a problem which, I'll give you just my opinion thing, I would think we should have people infuriated, should have people really upset and really angry. Other people are in poverty, maybe I'm not, other people in poverty, they're my brothers and sisters. They're fellow Americans. Not even counting people in poverty outside the country, who are in many cases having an even worse time, who are fellow humans. But if you just want to concentrate on the fellow Americans, somebody might say, how can you let that happen? And the funny thing about problems like this, about great injustices like this, and this is a great injustice, is that people go along for years and years and years thinking, oh, well, it's, it's inevitable. Or they tell themselves stories like, you get what you deserve. So if you're in poverty or you're in precarity, you deserve to be there. Because if you worked harder, if you had better character, if you did this, that, or the other thing, you'd be fine. You'd be comfortable. You'd be at least middle class. Maybe you'd be rich. If you were smarter. This is the kind of story I want to tell you that it's a vicious, untrue story. It's true in a handful of cases. In most cases, it's not true. People don't deserve to be where they are. But it's the story that not only do comfortable people tell the story about people who are in trouble, but working people tell these stories about themselves. There's a famous chapter in a book some of you may know, the sociologists especially, by Sennett and Cobb, called The Hidden Injuries of Class, in which the authors go into a plant where they're a big factory with thousands of workers. And each year in that plant, where there are like 2,500 workers, there are 20 or 30 supervisors' jobs that come up. So they go and they go and interview the workers, and they say, would you like to be a supervisor? And most of the workers say, yeah. And then they say, how come you're not a supervisor? And the answer, again and again and again, I'm not good enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm not well educated enough. I didn't work hard enough. I'm not this, I'm not that. And then the author says, are you aware there's only 25 jobs and there are 2,500 people? Are you aware that 1,000 people applied for the job and you didn't get it? Yeah. And so I didn't get it. If I had done this different, if I had done that different, I would have gotten it. People taking personal responsibility for a situation in which the deck is totally stacked against them, and in which it's basically a crapshoot who gets the job. So you know that. We all have these tendencies to blame ourselves for things that go wrong. But the tendency in America to blame yourself for your social situation and to make the assumption that the people who are doing really well deserve to do well, the people who are not don't, is a crippling philosophy. If that's true, there's nothing to be done about this problem except hope that you'll work a little harder or get some more education, everything will be all right. Doesn't work. So we talk about these problems in a way that's so dry and so statistical that doesn't often reveal much moral outrage, in part, I think, because to get from a sense of injustice to a sense of outrage, which might make you want to do something about it, takes not only an appreciation that the situation is unjust. Suppose you agree with me that people generally don't deserve to be where they are in the social ladder, and especially now that we know you're stuck in whatever class you're born into. Most people are. Once you know that, you're really outraged. And the answer, I think, is no, not unless you think that something can be done about it. If you think there's injustice, plus there's a vision of a better way to do it, then you get morally outraged. So you might ask, for example, how could Americans put up with slavery for as many years as they did, as centuries as they did? And the answer partly is that a lot of people were making money out of it and so forth. But part of the answer also was this, you might say, failure of imagination. That people had not conceived of what a slaveless country would look like. What a country based on free labor would look like. And when they finally did, and when some extremists of the time, called abolitionists, made that vision real for lots of people, then people said what they always say after the moral outrage comes. They say, how could we have put up with that for so many years? How could we have lived with this? But this was being done to our fellow human beings and done to our fellow Americans. And they look back and they say, it's inconceivable that we lived with this for so long. Someday they're going to look back on poverty and inequality in the richest nation in the world, one of the richest nations in the world, and say that, I think. How could we have put up with this much poverty and inequality and precarity for so long? How could we have put 2 million people in jail basically because they don't have enough money to stay out of jail? Not enough jobs, not enough decent jobs, not enough decent education, not enough early childhood education. Not enough, we can list what you might need to have a chance at a decent life instead of being a gangbanger and a drug runner. Then we might also ask, when we realized that more than a third of the prison population, of this enormous prison population, is in jail for minor drug offenses, how could we have let that continue? There are people in jail, there are people doing 15 to 30 under the so-called Rockefeller laws from New York, simply because they got arrested for selling some drugs at the wrong time. 15 to 30 years in jail, are you kidding? So Marion Barry, who's not my hero, usually, the former mayor of Washington, D.C., community organizer, mayor of Washington, D.C., who's got himself into all kinds of trouble from time to time, comes out with a proposal saying, recently, I think we ought to outlaw the question on employment applications that says, do you have a criminal record? Barry says. Why? Because it means you never get out of jail. You get out of jail and you can't possibly get a job if you're listing on the employment application that you have a criminal record, or if you lie and then it's discovered that you have a criminal record. So Barry says, if you want to stop recycling criminals, eliminate the question. Oh, no, we can't do that. And, oh, no, we need to know who has a criminal record. No, you don't. You need to give people jobs. So when the moral outrage, which we're going to come to in a minute, will depend on people having some ideas about how to do this better, about how to fix it. And there are some serious obstacles to thinking about how to fix it. Now, these are not obstacles among conservatives or among liberals. They're almost uniform. Whatever your politics, there's a problem. Because we not only tend to think of these issues statistically and dryly and unemotionally in the way that I just said, we also pull the problems apart. We think of, oh, here's a problem, not enough jobs in the inner city. And oh, here's another problem, not enough jobs in poor rural areas. That's a different problem. Or here's another problem, deindustrialization of vast areas of the US like the Midwest. But in lots of the South, and lots of, you know as well as I. Deindustrialization. And here's another problem, unemployment. The unemployment rate is too high. And here's another problem, jobs are being outsourced. So that globalization is actually depriving us of jobs when it should be created. Well, when you pull the problems apart like this, and you look at them one by one, then that invites you to try to find a solution for each problem separately. And what it pushes aside is the question, the vital question. To what extent are all these problems being produced by the same systemic features? To what extent are all these problems, first of all, interrelated so that one produces another? Right? No job, we know about no jobs and crime, and you could do it. If you try to do a map of these various problems and how they're related to each other, you end up with a cobweb because they're all interrelated. But the question then arises, what about their source? Why do we consider a 6 to 8% rate of unemployment full employment? What caused the war on poverty to be lost? What happened to the Job Corps? What happened to maximum feasible participation? What happened to other aspects of the war on poverty, including suggestions, by the way, like that there should be a guaranteed annual income for all Americans. There should be a minimum income that you're entitled to because you're a citizen of a rich country. You know who was the last president to propose that? Do you know who? Anybody want to guess? Roosevelt? Makes sense, but that's not right. It was Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon, who created the Legal Services Corporation. Right? Richard Nixon, who funded community-based community service organizations, and who even proposed, pressured from below, he proposed the guaranteed annual income. So you can see how far we've come when there's more creative proposals to deal with poverty coming out of the Nixon administration than the Obama administration. You can see how far right, if you like, the country has swung. Or you could see how, another way to look at this is, how unwilling we are to think about a system whose dysfunctions produce all of these wretched results, this poverty and this inequality. There are some very interesting analyses of how the system does this, but so far they haven't cracked. They haven't cracked the consciousness of the opinion makers, of the major newspapers, of the elite groups that run the Democratic and Republican parties. You'll find such ideas, by the way, if you simply read the newspapers. If you read the New York Times and you read Paul Krugman, who's a Nobel-winning columnist, not a red. He's not red enough for me, actually. But what he says is that you have a chronic problem of overproduction and relative underconsumption in societies like ours, advanced capitalist societies like ours, in which we have the ability to produce all this stuff, and we do produce all this stuff, but we have not been able to put enough purchasing power in the hands of our people and people abroad to soak up all that production. So the economy has a natural tendency to go into depressions, to recession or depression, unless something happens to generate that demand, unless the government in particular generates the demand. So that we already know that. I mean, we know, for example, that if we didn't have a military-industrial complex creating enormous demand for goods and services, that the economic situation would be even worse. And that, of course, is, that's a sad commentary, that we are dependent on war production in order to keep our economy healthy at all. If it disappeared, we'd have to find some other way to generate that kind of demand. Well, This is just one factor, and I'm not going to give you a lecture on economics, which I'm not an expert on anyway. But where it leads is interesting, I think. Where it leads is interesting. Because if there are system features, systemic features, and by the way, the people who believe this, that it's the system that's in trouble, not just a little, these are not glitches. 40 years of wage stagnation is not just a little glitch. The people who believe it are people like Warren Buffett and George Soros and the Nobelist Stiglitz and the Nobelist who I've just mentioned. Business people, right? Not Marxist revolutionaries, who are saying there's something wrong with the system. So then the question is, okay, well, if there is, and there's more and more evidence that there is, what can be done about it? How do you transform a system? And this is the question that interests me most of all as a conflict resolver. I think it's the most important question that's facing our field, the field of conflict analysis and resolution right now, and it's a question I'm writing my next book on, which is, we know that there are lots of conflicts that can be dealt with because they're interpersonal, they're between two people, or they're within a family, then you have to deal with the family unit. Even conflicts sometimes between ethnic or religious groups can be dealt with without necessarily considering what kind of system exists that's generating that conflict. But when we deal with the kinds of social ills that we know flow from poverty and inequality, and when we deal with conflicts between social groups, between social classes in countries like the United States, in advanced countries, then the question that comes before us is, if the system is generating the conflict, how do you change the system? How do you resolve the conflict? You don't just call up a mediator. A lot of the methods that we like to use in conflict resolution are not particularly useful when it comes to system-generated conflict, or what some people are calling structural conflict. So, what will work? Well, there's two places to look. Well, more than two, but here are a couple of places to look. One is you look at your own past. What does American history teach you about dealing with system-related social problems? Well, you could look at various eras of American history when people confronted these problems and tried to deal with them. And the most interesting, when you're talking about poverty and inequality, is the New Deal. In the 1930s, Franklin Roosevelt came to power without an idea in his head about how to deal with the Depression. He really didn't know very much. Then the country started to mobilize. People at the grassroots mobilized. A labor movement, and a movement of elderly people. Elements even of a women's movement and a civil rights movement. Very powerful farmers movement, etc. And what started to happen in the country was people getting up on their hind legs and saying, listen, there are certain things that we deserve as a matter of right. We're not interested necessarily in overthrowing the capitalist system, but a job is a right. We demand jobs. Not just when times are good, you know, when the business cycle permits it, or whatever. All the time, for everybody able to work. They should have a job. And if private enterprise can't produce the jobs, government should. So Roosevelt comes out with the Civilian Conservation Corps, which put thousands of people to work doing conservation work. Tens of thousands, actually. He comes out with the Public Works Administration, in which people are employed sometimes directly by government, sometimes by companies with government support, to rebuild the failing infrastructure, a crumbling infrastructure. Don't we have a crumbling infrastructure? Don't we have potentially hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of potential jobs that don't necessarily require an advanced degree in computer science to do? Isn't it true that private enterprise isn't doing it? Well, the question might be asked, somebody's got to do it, because it's a right. A job is a right. Or, you could say, you look at the New Deal, and you find the Tennessee Valley Authority. This was a government-funded project to bring under control the wild waters of the South, and to create dams, and on the basis of water power, electricity for the most underdeveloped part of the United States. People in this state, but especially in Kentucky and Tennessee and Louisiana and Georgia and so forth, today owe their livelihoods to the Tennessee Valley Authority. When that was done, a lot of people said, well, that's the first of many projects. We ought to keep on doing this until the whole country reaches a higher level of development. But it was the last. Because at that point, a lot of the people who ran private industry, the private business and the banks said, we don't want government competing with us. Don't worry, we'll do it. The private sector will do it. Yeah, but they didn't. The private sector did. During the war on poverty, when I was active in Chicago politics, or anti-politics, there were various proposals to use government under popular control, and I want to say more about that in 1 second, to revitalize the inner cities, the ghettos. People looked at what was happening in the inner cities and they said, oh my God, this can't be happening in the ghettos. And therefore we need this program and that program and the other program. And private enterprise said, don't worry, we'll handle it. Right? We'll bring businesses to the places where there were even proposals to subsidize the companies that would do that in the inner city areas. Never happened. Never happened. Never happened. As a result, the drug business became the game. Right? So if you go down the list, and I'm not going to go on and on and on with this, you find that in the time of the New Deal, there were these creative ideas put forward by people who weren't particularly radical, but who were absolutely convinced that something had to be done to secure the American people in their social and economic rights, including the right to a decent job. Roosevelt got up and said there are 1/3 of the nation ill-clad, ill-housed, and ill-fed, and that cannot go on. Well, over 20% of the nation is now in poverty. So the New Deal impulse, which is part of our heritage, it's part of the Democratic Party's heritage, which the Democratic Party has mainly forgotten, is meaningful, right? It's inspiring. And it's inspiring in particular because it was not just a top-down thing that the government did. If that had been the case, it never would have happened. Or if it had happened, it might have created a kind of tyranny. People worry about big government a lot. This is just my opinion. I don't have the answers, but this is my opinion. Big government's not the problem. And it's also not the solution. The solution is big government supported by very active citizens. A powerful government supported by a powerfully organized, militant citizenry. That's what you had in the New Deal. That's what you had in many national efforts where significant transformation and change is taking place. Not just strong government, but strength at the grassroots. So if you're hoping that this is going to happen somehow or other now, there's a question then that we would have to ask ourselves, which is what can we do to create that missing element, that militant that organized citizenry at the grassroots level. We see some signs of it happening here and there. Occupy movement, for example, on the left, but also community-based movements on the right. Movements even of religious groups, both right and left, to try to create the public services that the public is entitled to, which government is not creating. So if you look around the country, you find interesting things are happening, and I think it's all bubbling. I think it's bubbling underground. It needs to be brought together. It needs to be thought about. It needs to be organized. But I can name a couple of things that I think are worth your thinking about. One of them is the work of Gar Alperovitz at the University of Maryland. Alperovitz has an institute, is one of the senior political science and economics professors at the University of Maryland, that has an outfit dedicated to finding new methods of production based on communities which are community-owned and controlled. He thinks that nothing can, he doesn't think that this can happen on a national basis. And he disagrees with me when I say we need a New Deal, because he thinks it has to happen first on the community basis. That's where the experimentation takes place. That's where people get together, decide to collectively build a local economic enterprise, own it in common, and make it succeed. This is happening. Alperovitz's people are working in about 20 cities now, and some very interesting evidence is piling up about what works. I'll give you another example. There's a man I used to work for, actually, when I was a lawyer in Washington, called Edgar Kahn. And Edgar has pioneered what some people call time money, which is a system in which people who are not doing well in the official economy, who are excluded for one reason or another from the official economy, but who have skills, provide each other with services. This started in Florida with retired people, where you have people who were living very badly, who were in poverty, basically, who had retired to Florida, but they had retired to poverty. And some of them were, could cut hair, and some of them could grow flowers. Started out with the people saying, I'll cut your hair if, you grow me some flowers. What was needed was a system of some kind of currency. And the currency, a script, was developed so that when you cut the hair, you would be paid in the script. Or when you grew the flowers, you would be paid. And they call the script time money. 32 cities are using this system in poor communities of one kind or another. Either poor communities, either because of racial discrimination or because of age issues or for some other issue. Or because the big business has abandoned the community. So there are signs of interesting things happening. Okay? A next step, however, it seems to me, two next steps, let me talk about quickly and then I'll finish. One is, how do we know what the causes of poverty and inequality really are? How do we know, aside from, we can read this column or this book or that book, this article, how do we know what's really going on, what the source of the problem is? Number one. Number two, how do we know which kinds of responses to the problem work and which are just, do a little good here or do a little good there, but really don't have don't have legs, or can't be expanded? Well, to answer that question requires concentrated study, publicity, well-known people making themselves available and making their names available to throw the kind of light on the continuous light on the problem of poverty and inequality, because one of the problems, the way we think about it and deal with it now, is that we think about it for 5 minutes, and, think about it for 10 minutes, and who likes to think about it, So there's no continuous focus on the problem and no continuous attempt to develop the solutions. Well, I think if we had a national commission on the causes and prevention of poverty and inequality, the way we had a national commission on the causes and prevention of racism, the Kerner Commission, or a national commission on the causes and prevention of various kinds of violence that I worked on, actually, when I was young, and had well-known people on the commission, and had the commission hold hearings in 6 or 7 cities in several rural areas, and have people testify before that commission as to what's the problem in this community? What do you think is causing the problem? What kind of alternatives are there? What community programs are actually working? And which have we discovered don't work, even if we try? That would make a major advance. I think that would be a major event for us, because it would focus public attention on a problem that even President Obama, who I think means very well, doesn't. You know, if you listen to the State of the Union address, you wouldn't have heard the word poverty once. He talked about some of the related problems, but he didn't talk about poverty, and he didn't talk about system dysfunction. He talked about separate problems and proposed this, let's do this to this, and let's do that. And then in a very vague way, he said, let's create more jobs. But who's going to create the jobs? How's that going to happen? Well, one of the things we discovered in conflict resolution, and let me close with this, is that a chief obstacle to resolving conflict is you need really 3 things to resolve a conflict. You need analysis to begin with. You need to try to understand what's going on. And when I say you need to understand, the parties, the people most involved, the people need to understand what's going on, not the experts who always think they have the answers and hardly ever do. So people need to analyze and to understand. Analysis is one of the things that's necessary. The second thing that's necessary, which is more mysterious, but maybe more important, is imagination. Freedom to imagine an alternative. And the reason that's so difficult to do is because there are so many taboos. Right? If I, just in my little talk here, which I've been careful to not be too inflammatory, and I talk big government and the New Deal, and then people are thinking, socialist, he must be a socialist. Well, maybe I am and maybe I'm not, right? But if I am, why shouldn't a socialist alternative, whatever that means, be thinkable? You've got to allow yourself the freedom to think of possible alternatives before you can say, oh, this won't work, this costs too much. And what we find in conflict resolution is at a certain point, you have to do the costing out of proposed solutions. If you start costing before you let your imagination loose and let all the possibilities for resolution that there are occur to you, then you shortcut the whole process. You constrict the process. You never find out what might work. Here's another example from the New Deal of that. At a time when only communists and anarchists and a few other loonies were talking about Social Security, a guy named Upton Sinclair ran for, who was also a writer, novelist, ran for governor of California as an independent. And everybody totally wrote him off. This guy is a loony, and he's a nut. The program that he presented was Social Security. It wasn't called Social Security yet, he had another name for it. He was elected governor of California. And at that point, the Roosevelt administration said, what is this Social Security? You know, what is this? Maybe we ought to think about it. Because maybe instead of being a kind of radical idea that'll overthrow everything we hold dear, maybe it's the kind of creative radical reform that'll enable us to preserve what we want to preserve. Because we'll be able to change what needs to be changed. So this kind of dreaming we need to do it. And I think maybe a national commission would be one way to get that sort of thing started, or maybe there are other ways, better ways to get it started. But we can't be hemmed in by taboos. And the third thing that is needed, of course, is that once you come up with solutions, how do you implement them? How do you implement them? That requires political organization. The two-party system almost never organizes anything or anything worthwhile. At least they don't organize anything that doesn't result in them holding on to their offices. So if you go back through American history and look at the social movements that have actually produced creative results, you find almost all of them originating outside the two-party system. Even the anti-slave movement, you know, was eventually created a party, the Republican Party, but it began outside the two-party system. So without waiting for the parties to catch up, that's our next job, you know. I think it's to organize with each other through communities, through the churches, through the schools, universities, groups dedicated to trying to find workable solutions to the problems of poverty, inequality, and precarity, and then trying to put them into effect on whatever level it seems feasible, whether it's a community level, a local level, a state level. Some cases, you can only do it on the federal level. So, as in the case of Social Security, you make that a proposal. And partly because of gridlock, partly because of the kind of generally defeatist view that's spread in the country of politics. The politicians won't do anything. You can't do anything. We're all powerless and so forth. Fortunately, one of the things we know is that that's just a mood. That's just a mood. It ends. That mood ends. When I had just started teaching in Chicago in the late 60s, the national mood changed radically. And the next few decades were very interesting because of that. It's happened before, it's going to happen again, and it's important that it happens creatively and peacefully, because if it doesn't happen peacefully, it'll happen violently. We know that people are not going to put up with this situation forever, just sit back and take it. We know that the violence that they are already resorting to is violence against each other, which is getting a lot of people hurt and jailed, and so forth. And we also know, because the history of social movements tells us, that if you don't solve the problems, you get mass violence of a different kind. You get riots, you get terrorism, you get, it happens. So I don't know how much time we have left to get our act together, but I think we can if we want to. That's what I wanted to say. So thank you very much. And now if people want to leave here, they're free to, and if they want to stay and talk, that'll be good.
All right, so how do we get people motivated?
How what?
How do we get people motivated to get involved? I do over 100 a semester, and I haven't seen any of them go forward. It's one of my big goals of my sociology class is get involved. How do we do it?
Well, I have a couple of responses to that. One response is that, in a way, the question's unanswerable, because it takes a certain kind of combination of, it takes the spark and the tinder, it takes a combination of a situation and a trigger. So that if people like you and I want to get other people involved and we talk about it, and the time is right, and the group is right, and and the events, certain events have occurred, people will get involved to our great surprise. And we don't know exactly why, except that the right the right combination of elements has occurred. But I would say something else, and that is there's a problem with we getting them involved. I think one of the things that we need to do is to see how people are getting themselves involved already. That is to find out how they want to get involved. There is a tendency when things are passive. So when the situation people are being passive, then there's a tendency to do what I'm doing here tonight and lecture at them, or exhort them. And that doesn't move them necessarily, They have to want to do it. They have to want to do it themselves. How many psychiatrists does it take to screw in a light bulb, One, but the light bulb has to want to be screwed in. One of the things I've been doing more lately is kind of getting groups of students together. I mean, since that's where I can operate is in school and in certain churches and synagogues. Right? You get people together and invite them to consider the problem, the issue, and can anything be done, and what might be fun to do, and what do you think? And kind of lay back and see what emerges. But other than that, that's probably not terribly useful either. But other than that, I don't know how to answer the question.
Because what you see is that people they're not having the time that when we were growing up, our parents had right now, because they're working at least 2 jobs just to survive. And that's to keep them from that one thing that makes them homeless because of illness, because of like what you said. So where's the time element?
I agree with that.
We're losing all of our volunteer things, the Kiwanis, the Knights of Columbus, these things that rely on volunteers,
Yeah.
United Way, because people don't have the time.
But then, then they don't have the time. They didn't have the time in Russia in 1917, and they didn't have the time in America in 1976. People take the time. Sometimes they just take it. They say, I've reprioritized. I got to do this. And there was that feeling. I mean, I certainly don't want to tell war stories, peace stories about the 60s and 70s, but it was certainly that feeling that this wasn't really a choice. That you just had to do it. So when will that happen here? I don't know. Except maybe in some ways it's already happening. I mean, I know of course, my students are, self-selected. They want to resolve conflicts and stuff, so they're highly motivated. Still, they're very busy, and they're working. Almost all of them are working, outside jobs at the same time as they're going to George Mason, which is a poor state university that doesn't have scholarship money, hardly any, and so on. So I announced let's get together, let's get a working group together, non-credit, by the way, no academic credit for this, and talk about poverty and inequality and all that stuff. I had to move the thing to a bigger room because the room would hold only 25 people. And there's only, 300-400 students in that, graduate students in that crowd. There are a lot of people interested in this. And, I think that, because I think people really do appreciate how bad it is, and it's hurting them directly. I mean, the loans, people are drowning with these loans, right?
Gas prices went up another 10 cents today.
So, but I think you raise a very good question, because people sometimes don't want to take risks if they're too close to the line. Yeah.
How would you start to approach your cultural conflict in a situation where the government or the social system is already unstable or in flux, in between shifting? Kind of like what we see happening in the Arab Spring.
Well, yes. the way that I and some of my colleagues approach issues like that, like the Arab Spring kind of thing, is to kind of avoid labeling the parties to conflicts. Avoid making the good guy, bad guy distinction as far as possible between parties to conflicts who generally are doing both good and bad things. Anyway. And looking at, let's say, the Syrian conflict, which in my view should have been looked on with the Libyan conflict too, as a civil war, in which one side is not Snow White and the other black, or pick your color. Still use those racist color codes, don't we? But at any rate, so that, you try to find out what the parties really want. And in a case like Syria or other unstable societies, what they want is a system that will serve their needs, that will satisfy their needs. So you're dealing with a constitutional crisis, where the people are conscious that what they need is a new system, and then they disagree about what kind of system it should be. Right? So it's not a conservative-liberal split, let's change a little faster or a little slower. It's what kind of society do we want to live in? My theory about conflict here and in Europe as well, in the industrialized countries, is that we're moving towards a constitutional crisis. That is, the fact that failure to solve these problems precipitates people out. And one of the things it does, it inclines people to embrace crazy solutions, false solutions. One of the things I read when I was in college and also in grad school that I recommend that everybody read when they get the chance is an essay by the historian Richard Hofstadter called The Paranoid Style in American Politics. It's called The Paranoid Style in American Politics, where Hofstadter says, you got people out there who think that the reason the price of their agricultural products is so low, they can't make a living on the farm anymore, is because of the international Jewish conspiracy. Or other people think it's not the international Jewish conspiracy, it's the Masons. Or it's the Vatican, it's the Pope. Where does the paranoia, so you can call it paranoid, but that doesn't help. Where does the paranoia come from? And he says it comes from people who are aware that they are powerless to deal with the causes of problems that are afflicting them. They're unable to analyze the problem, because nobody's helping them to do that. And they're unable to implement any solutions that they might think of because they don't have the power. So the paranoia is rooted in reality. The reality is powerless people who are become aware of their powerlessness and then start looking for the black helicopters of the UN, or start thinking that